This is Zach Weiss with Worn and Wound, and today I'm going to be taking a look at the Horage Lensman 1. Before I get into it, if you enjoyed this video, please do like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's very much appreciated. So Horage, who is Horage? Horage is a Swiss watch brand, but I really like to think of them more as a Swiss movement specialist that happens to make watches. So I first became aware of them in 2015, and I wrote an article about them when I stumbled across a movement they were making called the K1. What was really interesting about that movement is that they had their own in-house silicone escapement, which was really quite rare, particularly in 2015. Additionally, it had a modular design, so it can take complications without getting much larger. It was all just very unique and exciting just to see as an alternative to the kind of brands, the more established brands that we see more often. A few years later, they followed that up with a really cool movement called the K2, which I actually reviewed in a watch last year called the Superseed. The K2 is a Swiss-made micro-rotor movement with like a 72-hour power reserve, and that can also take complications without getting very thick. So the whole thing was, about 3 millimeters to 3.5 millimeters thick. Just very exciting movement technology. But frankly, none of that has anything on this watch here. So this watch, the Lensman 1, as you might have noticed, is a Tourbillon. Actually, let me say that again. It's an in-house Tourbillon. An in-house Swiss-made Tourbillon. An in-house Swiss-made Tourbillon with a silicone escapement. Okay, one more time. An in-house Swiss-made Tourbillon with a silicone escapement and a 120-hour power reserve that's available for just under $10,000. It's actually 8,890 Swiss francs, which comes to around $9,600 at the current conversion. Just let that sink in for a second. Tourbillons are notoriously expensive. Swiss-made tourbillons are even more expensive. In-house Swiss-made tourbillons are exceptionally expensive. But here we have one that is just shy of 10K, which isn't inexpensive, but for a tourbillon is truly kind of a remarkable price. But that's actually not all that makes this movement exciting. It also features a titanium tourbillon cage and just some really great design and tech all around. For more about that, please read the in-depth review because I can't get into all of it here today. So with the Lensman 1, though, there's more to it than just a tourbillon. There's actually a whole concept going on here, as is indicated perhaps by the name. So the watch is inspired by photography and sort of the innovation that went into early photography equipment, and how that sort of translates over to the innovation that is the Tourbillon by Abraham Louis Breguet. Obviously, there's also really good crossover between both the photo enthusiast market as well as the watch enthusiast market, as well as within the brand of Horage, some professional photographers and enthusiast photographers. So that is what was sort of the genesis for the idea of making a watch inspired by photography. So how does that translate? Well, along the case, there are some pretty literal translations here. So along the mid case, you'll actually find markings all the way around on both sides, around the crown, and actually even between the lugs that correspond to markings one might find on an f/.95 lens. And of course, for the photo enthusiasts out there, you'll know that's an extremely fast lens that would be kind of pretty rare and also very expensive. So even that is a little sort of wink towards this being, really enthusiast focus. So you'll find the actual f-stops around the crown, and then all the other numerals sort of indicate or suggest sort of meter and distance readings. Now, additionally, the bezel itself is inspired by kind of the grip one might find on the focus ring of a lens. So there's a fluted texture going around the bezel. And then the screw-down crown features an inset onyx stone cap there, so it looks a little bit like a shutter release. One thing I will say about both those details, though, is that obviously on a watch, when you put a textured bezel, it makes you want to turn it. This bezel, however, is fixed. Additionally, the button that is in the center of that crown just makes me want to push it. Now, there isn't any markings. There's no reason why you would turn the bezel or push that crown, but they both communicate that they want to sort of be touched, as they are based on things that are touched and are pressed. The dial, however, is a little bit less literal. So the dial, as you could probably see here, is all black. It's a very dark dial. It features black gold applied indices with matte black lume fill. Between those indices is then a fluted texture, and around the edge of the bezel are numerals printed in dark gray. So the whole thing is very subtle, very dim. But what it does do in an interesting way is catch the light. So if there's anything that one does in photography, it's literally capture light and then process it in various ways. So I think there's sort of an interesting, conceptual translation there. So obviously I'm sort of dancing around the most sort of visually impactful detail of this watch, which is the absolutely giant Cyclops at 6. This is the lens man of the Lensman. And so what does it do? Well, it puts the subject in focus. And what is the subject of this watch? It is the tourbillon. As for the case itself, it's made out of grade 5 titanium and measures 41 millimeters in diameter, 49 millimeters lug to lug, 10.3 millimeters thick, which is actually, it seemed like quite a good dimension. It seemed fairly thin, particularly for something as complicated as a tourbillon. Perhaps that's average though. And it has a 22 millimeter lug width. Because it is made out of titanium, the watch is actually exceptionally light, coming in at 64 grams on a strap. It really was actually quite surprising when I first tried it on. And now I'll actually put it on and let's talk about it on the wrist. On the wrist, the Lensman 1 really is very light, and I think the weight of it sort of belies the size of the watch, because it barely feels like I'm wearing anything, and yet I do think that the Lensman reads as a fairly large watch. It has a pretty large dial opening here that's obviously all dense black because of the dial, so it looks fairly big, at least on my 7-inch wrist, and is a little bit outside of, I'd say, my personal preference in terms of sizing. That said, 41 millimeters isn't huge. It's sort of a medium watch. And I will say, from a view from the back of the watch, you can see that the movement itself really fills out the watch. So I kind of doubt that they could go much smaller than this. Additionally, the grade 5 titanium has been, very nicely finished. They did utilize the fact that one can polish grade 5 titanium, as well as its sort of brighter color than other titanium. So at a glance, it almost looks like it is polished steel. This is a $10,000 watch, obviously, so a high level of finishing is to be expected. And I would say, this is good. There's nothing really outstanding or fancy about the finishing either, but it certainly isn't disappointing. Moving to the dial, I will say that it is a bit hard to read. It's very dark. The gray numerals that are around the edge of the dial are basically invisible. Everything else is very, very subtle. You really only see it as it sort of catches and glints in the light, depending on, obviously, the brightness of the space you are in. And then the black lume that fills in the black gold markers doesn't really do very much at all. Black lume, in my experience, is never very good. It's only really suggestive. Considering they use onyx on the crown, I actually would have loved to have seen onyx inset into those markers instead. So how do you read the dial? Well, it has two fairly large hands that then have kind of a classic lume strip on those. And frankly, I just look at the hands. It's sort of like reading a dial that has no markings on it, that just has two hands that you see. Obviously, also, this doesn't take away from the tourbillon. The tourbillon really is the focus here under that giant Cyclops. That is kind of what you are meant to be staring at. Functionally speaking, telling the time does seem to have been deprioritized a little bit for style. In terms of the movement, well, it does seem to be quite remarkable. That is really the big draw, I think, for the Lensman 1. In practice, wearing a tourbillon is like wearing any other watch. It just tells the time. People argue if the tourbillon is really a complication or it's really more of sort of a system because it doesn't necessarily add any functionality. It's really meant to counteract gravity's effects on an escapement. Argument for a different day. It certainly is visually quite interesting to look at and adds a lot of intrigue to the movement, and it just has a lot of meaning to us watch collectors. In terms of the design of this movement, though, I appreciate that Horage tries to do something different. This is something I saw in the K2 as well. This is a 10K tourbillon, so you're not going to find hand anglage and beautiful polished, screw caps and things like that. Instead, they go for a more modern style of finishing. You have a sort of a skeletonized base plate here with a grid pattern on it. It has been plated black and has been brushed. You have a skeletonized barrel here as well with an interesting pattern on it. A very long click that's, fun to watch when you wind it. It all comes together to be a visually appealing and much more modern watch. So I think they've managed to mix the excitement and the technical aspects of a tourbillon with perhaps a more affordable, more cost-effective way of finishing that is still appealing looking. I'm definitely happy that they didn't try and fake a high-end finish on this. In terms of the specs, apart from the Tourbillon, the watch beats at 25,200 beats per hour. It is said to keep within chronometer specs, but it is not actually chronometer certified. Obviously, it has a 120-hour power reserve, as I said before, which is 5 days. You know, that's a massive power reserve. It takes a very long time to wind the watch. One thing I do find a little annoying or unfortunate is that there is no power reserve indicator. When you're winding for a 5-day movement, it takes a long time. And additionally, for some reason, they have a screw-down crown on a manual watch. This is not something I particularly like to see on a manual watch, as you do inevitably have to wind it regardless of how long of a power reserve that is. Unscrewing it every time is a little bit more annoying, and it just feels like it's an opportunity for something to go wrong. You're rethreading it every single time. It just feels like something could go wrong there, and you know, that would obviously be unfortunate. So to wrap up, there's a lot to think about here with the Horage Lensman. You know, it's a watch about photography, sometimes literally, sometimes not. It's also a tourbillon, which is this coveted luxury complication. While I personally enjoy photography, I have a few cameras, I have a bunch of lenses, I would consider myself an enthusiast. I don't think I'm in the market for a $10,000 watch that's inspired by photography. You know, that's more than my entire kit. I think that's probably more than many people, especially enthusiasts, entire photography kit. It seems a little bit out of balance. You know, a photography inspired watch that's really clever, that's, you know, in the $1,000 to, I don't know, $3,000 range, even less, $500 to $3,000 range, let's say. You know, I think that there is something there for people who are really die-hard into photography. That said, I am probably in the market, if I could afford it right now or at any point, for a $10,000 Swiss-made tourbillon. That's what really attracts me to this watch. This is a high-end movement. This is a coveted movement. You know, this is the kind of thing that as a watch collector, you're sort of told is always out of grasp unless you're really, you know, happen to be a very, very fortunate collector. And while 10K is certainly expensive, it is a lot more within reach. I mean, put this into perspective, there are steel watches that are just time only out there that cost quite a bit more than this. So what I want from a tourbillon that's accessible is frankly a timeless design. You know, I want something that puts the focus on the tourbillon and really doesn't have any other concept going along with it. Nothing that's distracting from the real reason why I personally am interested in the tourbillon, which is the movement itself. And Horage knocked the movement out of the park here. You know, I think they really have something incredible here, and I think that they could just focus on that and have something that's even more successful. That said, if you like what's going on here, if you are interested in the photography aspect, I think they did some really great things, and the execution overall is quite high. So just to reiterate, this is the Lensman 1 by Horage. It costs 8,890 Swiss francs, which is around $9,600 USD at time of recording. If you are interested in purchasing this watch, for more details, obviously check out horage.com. And for the full review, please check out wornandwound.com. Thank you.